The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Westminster Abbey like a gentle shroud, as if the very building understood the gravity of the day ahead. King Charles III stood at the tall windows of his private study in Buckingham Palace, watching the early December light struggle through the London fog. His reflection stared back at him, a man who had waited 7 decades to wear the crown that now sat heavy not just on his head, but on his conscience. The call from the Archbishop of Canterbury had come 3 weeks earlier. "Your Majesty, we must discuss the Advent ceremony," Justin Welby had said, his voice carrying that particular weight that comes with centuries of tradition. "This year feels different, more significant somehow." Charles had known exactly what the Archbishop meant. This would be his first Advent as king, his first opportunity to lead the nation into the most sacred season of the Christian calendar. The ceremony at Westminster Abbey would not merely be a religious observance. It would be a statement about the kind of monarch he intended to be, the kind of spiritual leadership he would provide for a nation grappling with uncertainty. As he prepared for the short journey to the Abbey, Charles reflected on the conversations he had shared with his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, about the true meaning of monarchy in modern times. She had often spoken about being a servant to the people, about the crown being not a symbol of power, but of responsibility. Now, facing his first major religious ceremony as king, those words resonated more deeply than ever before. The king's private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, entered the room with the measured steps that spoke of decades spent in royal service. "Your Majesty, the Archbishop has arrived at the Abbey. The congregation is beginning to gather." Charles nodded, straightening the deep purple vestments that had been specially prepared for the occasion. The color purple, symbolic of both royalty and penitence, seemed particularly appropriate for this moment in his reign. He was no longer the Prince of Wales, the man who had spent decades preparing for this role. He was the king, and today would mark his first steps into the spiritual leadership of the nation. The journey from Buckingham Palace to Westminster Abbey took place in relative silence. Charles had specifically requested a smaller motorcade than usual, wanting the focus to remain on the religious significance of the day rather than the pageantry of monarchy. As the car wound through the streets of London, he watched ordinary people going about their daily lives, many unaware that their king was passing by, carrying the weight of tradition and the hopes of a nation. Westminster Abbey loomed before them, its Gothic spires reaching toward the gray December sky like stone prayers frozen in time. The building had witnessed over 1,000 years of English history, had seen the coronation of kings, and queens had hosted royal weddings and state funerals. Today, it would witness something equally significant, a monarch's commitment to spiritual leadership in an age when such leadership was desperately needed. Inside the Abbey, the atmosphere was one of reverent anticipation. The congregation included representatives from all walks of British life, politicians and poets, teachers and shopkeepers, young families and elderly couples who had witnessed the reign of 3 monarchs. They had come not just to observe a ceremony, but to participate in a moment that would define the spiritual tone of the new reign. The Archbishop of Canterbury stood at the altar, his white vestments a stark contrast to the deep shadows cast by the Abbey's ancient pillars. Justin Welby had served as Archbishop through the final years of Elizabeth II's reign, had officiated at her funeral, and now found himself in the unique position of guiding a new monarch through the spiritual dimensions of kingship. As Charles entered the Abbey, the congregation rose as one. The sound of hundreds of people standing in unison echoed through the vast space, a physical manifestation of the respect and expectation that surrounded this moment. The king walked slowly down the nave, his footsteps measured and deliberate, each step taking him closer to a role that would define not just his own spiritual journey, but potentially the spiritual direction of a nation. The service began with the lighting of the first Advent candle, a simple act that carried profound symbolism. Advent, the season of preparation and waiting, seemed particularly relevant for a monarchy that was itself in a period of transition. Just as Christians waited for the coming of Christ, so too was the nation waiting to see what kind of King Charles would become. The Archbishop's voice filled the abbey as he spoke about the meaning of Advent, about preparation and hope, about the responsibility of leadership in times of uncertainty. His words seemed directed not just at the congregation, but specifically at the man who sat in the front pew. The crown temporarily set aside, but the weight of kingship never truly absent. Advent reminds us that waiting is not passive. The Archbishop intoned. It is a time of active preparation, of making ourselves ready for something greater than ourselves. For those called to leadership, it is a time to consider how we can serve others, how we can be instruments of hope in a world that often seems devoid of it. Charles listened intently, understanding that these words were meant for him as much as for anyone in the congregation. His entire life had been a form of Advent, a long preparation for this moment. Now, as king, he faced the challenge of translating that preparation into meaningful leadership. The congregation joined in the singing of ancient hymns, their voices rising to the vaulted ceiling in harmonies that had been sung in this place for centuries. There was something deeply moving about this continuity, about the way tradition could provide stability in times of change. Yet Charles was also acutely aware that tradition alone was not enough. It had to be animated by genuine faith and sincere service. As the ceremony progressed, Charles found himself thinking about the many letters he had received since becoming king. Letters from ordinary people sharing their hopes and fears, their struggles and triumphs. Many had written about their faith, about their search for meaning in difficult times, about their hope that the monarchy might provide not just stability, but spiritual guidance. One letter in particular had stayed with him, written by a young mother from Manchester who had lost her job during the economic uncertainty of recent years. I pray that you will remember people like me, she had written, people who are struggling but still believe that things can get better. I hope you will be a king who understands that faith isn't just about Sunday services, but about how we treat each other every day of the week. The Archbishop continued with the service, leading prayers for the nation, for those in need, for wisdom in leadership. Each prayer seemed to carry additional weight in the presence of the king, as if the very act of royal participation transformed these familiar words into something more significant, more urgent. The reading from the Gospel of Matthew spoke of John the Baptist preparing the way for Christ, calling people to repentance and renewal. As the familiar words echoed through the abbey, Charles considered his own role as someone called to prepare the way, not for divine revelation, but for a kind of monarchy that could speak to the spiritual needs of modern Britain. The sermon that followed was one of the most important the Archbishop had ever delivered. He spoke about the role of monarchy in providing moral leadership, about the way symbols could become instruments of hope when they were animated by genuine conviction. His words were carefully chosen, acknowledging the challenges facing both the monarchy and the nation while offering a vision of what was possible when tradition and faith work together. A king's crown is heavy not because of its gold and jewels, the Archbishop said, his eyes meeting those of Charles, but because of the responsibility it represents. Today, as we begin the season of Advent, we are reminded that true leadership is about service, that true power is about lifting others up, that true greatness is measured not by what we achieve for ourselves, but by what we make possible for others. The congregation listened in rapt attention, sensing that they were witnessing something historic. This was not just another royal ceremony, but a moment of definition, a time when the spiritual direction of a new reign was being established. The abbey itself seemed to lean in, its ancient stones bearing witness to this pivotal moment. As the service moved toward its conclusion, Charles prepared for his own contribution to the ceremony. He had spent weeks crafting the words he would speak, wanting them to reflect both his personal faith and his understanding of the monarch's role in modern Britain. These would be among the most important words he would speak as king, setting the tone for everything that would follow. When King Charles rose to address the congregation, the silence in Westminster Abbey was profound. Every person present understood they were about to hear words that would echo through history, words that would define not just this ceremony, but the spiritual character of his reign. The king moved to the lectern with the quiet dignity that had marked his entire life, his presence commanding attention without demanding it. "My dear friends," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the vast space. "We gather today at the beginning of Advent, a season that speaks to the human heart about hope, preparation, and the possibility of renewal. For me, standing before you as your king for the first time during this sacred season, these themes carry particular weight." The congregation listened intently as Charles continued, his words carefully measured but filled with genuine emotion. He spoke about his mother's faith, about the way she had shown him that monarchy was not about privilege, but about service, not about ruling over people, but about serving with them. His voice carried the weight of grief still fresh from her passing, but also the strength of someone who had found purpose in that loss. "Throughout my life, I've tried to understand what it means to serve," he said. "My mother taught me that true service requires us to look beyond ourselves, to see the struggles and hopes of others, to use whatever position we have been given not for our own glory but for the good of all." Today, as we enter this season of waiting and preparation, I want to share with you what I believe this means for our nation. The king's words resonated through the abbey, touching something deep in the hearts of those present. This was not the formal, distant language of traditional royal speeches. This was personal, heartfelt, the words of a man who had spent decades thinking about the role he would one day be called to fill. Charles spoke about the challenges facing Britain, about economic uncertainty and social division, about the way traditional institutions were being questioned and sometimes found wanting. But rather than offering easy answers or false comfort, he spoke about the need for humility, for listening, for the kind of patient work that real change required. Advent teaches us that the most important transformations happen not in grand gestures, but in quiet preparation, he continued. They happen when we choose to see each other not as strangers or opponents, but as fellow travelers on a difficult journey. They happen when we choose hope over cynicism, service over self-interest, love over fear. In the congregation, people found themselves moved not just by the words, but by the obvious sincerity behind them. This was a king who seemed to genuinely understand the weight of his role, who spoke not from a position of assumed authority, but from one of acknowledged responsibility. The archbishop watched from his position near the altar, recognizing in the king's words the fruit of many private conversations they had shared over the years. Charles had always been a thoughtful man, someone who asked deep questions about faith and meaning. Now, speaking as king, those qualities were not diminished by the crown, but enhanced by it. As the king continued his address, he turned to the specific challenges of leadership in the modern world. He spoke about the temptation to seek easy popularity rather than pursue difficult truths, about the challenge of maintaining moral authority in an age of skepticism, about the need for leaders to be examples rather than simply giving orders. "I do not claim to have all the answers," Charles admitted, his honesty startling in its simplicity. "What I do claim is a commitment to seek them, to listen carefully to all voices in our society, to use the position I have been given not to impose my will, but to serve the common good. This is what I believe monarchy means in our time. Not rule, but service, not pronouncement, but listening, not judgment, but compassion." The words hung in the air of the abbey, their impact magnified by the setting and the occasion. This was a king unlike any who had come before, one who seemed to understand that true authority in the modern world came not from tradition alone, but from the willingness to earn respect through service and humility. Among the congregation sat Margaret Thompson, a retired teacher from Yorkshire who had taught for 40 years in state schools. She had come to London specifically for this ceremony, wanting to see for herself what kind of King Charles would be. As she listened to his words, she found herself unexpectedly moved. This was not what she had expected from a royal speech. This was something more personal, more real. Beside her sat David Chun, a young entrepreneur who had built a successful technology company while never forgetting his roots in a working-class family in Birmingham. He had been skeptical about the relevance of monarchy in the 21st century, but the king's words were challenging his assumptions. This was not the out-of-touch aristocrat he had expected, but someone who seemed genuinely committed to understanding and serving all parts of British society. Throughout the Abbey, similar reactions were taking place. People who had come expecting ceremony were instead encountering something deeper, something that spoke to their own hopes for what leadership could be in difficult times. The king's address moved into its final section, where he spoke specifically about the meaning of Advent for the nation. He talked about the way waiting could be transformative, the way preparation could lead to renewal, the way hope could be maintained even in difficult circumstances. As we light these Advent candles over the coming weeks, he said, let them remind us that we are all part of something larger than ourselves. Let them remind us that our individual actions matter, that our choices to be kind rather than cruel, generous rather than selfish, hopeful rather than cynical, contribute to the kind of society we create together. The king paused, looking out over the congregation with eyes that seemed to see each person individually while addressing them collectively. I ask for your prayers as I begin this journey as your king. I ask for your patience as I learn to serve you better. And I ask for your partnership as we work together to build a society worthy of our highest aspirations. As Charles concluded his remarks and returned to his seat, the Abbey erupted in applause, something unusual for such a formal religious ceremony. But the moment seemed to call for it, seemed to require some physical expression of the emotional impact his words had created. The service continued with the lighting of additional candles, each flame adding to the growing brightness in the Abbey. The symbolism was not lost on anyone present. From the darkness of uncertainty, light was gradually emerging. From the challenges of transition, hope was being born. The congregation joined in singing, O come, Emmanuel, their voices rising in ancient harmonies that seemed to carry new meaning in this context. The words about waiting for deliverance, about hoping for redemption, seemed to speak directly to the moment they were experiencing together. As the hymn concluded, the Archbishop offered a final prayer, asking for divine guidance for the king and for wisdom for all those called to leadership in difficult times. His words were traditional in form, but contemporary in application, bridging the gap between ancient faith and modern challenges. The ceremony was drawing to a close, but its impact was just beginning to be felt. In the hours and days that would follow, the king's words would be analyzed and discussed, quoted and debated. But for those present in the Abbey that morning, the immediate impact was clear. They had witnessed something significant, something that suggested the possibility of a different kind of monarchy for a new era. As the final prayers were offered and the last hymn sung, the congregation began to prepare for the recessional. But before that could begin, there was one more element to the ceremony, one that would prove to be among the most memorable moments of the entire service. The unexpected moment came when the Archbishop gestured for the congregation to remain seated. Before we conclude our service, he announced, His Majesty has requested an opportunity to meet personally with some of those who have joined us today. This was not part of the traditional ceremony, not something that had been publicly announced, but it was entirely in keeping with the spirit of what the king had expressed in his address. Charles rose from his seat and, instead of processing out of the Abbey in the formal manner expected for such occasions, he walked into the congregation. His security detail, though clearly concerned about the deviation from protocol, had been briefed about this possibility and moved discreetly to maintain appropriate protection while allowing the king maximum freedom to interact with people. The first person he approached was an elderly woman in the front section, Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, who was celebrating her 90th birthday and had specifically requested to attend this service as her birthday present. She had lived through the reigns of 4 monarchs and had never imagined she would have the opportunity to speak personally with the king. Your Majesty, she began nervously, but Charles immediately put her at ease. Please, he said, tell me about yourself. What brings you here today? Mrs. Hartwell's eyes filled with tears as she explained that she had served as a volunteer at a local food bank for over 20 years, had seen the need in her community grow dramatically in recent times, and had come to the service hoping to hear that the new king understood the struggles facing ordinary people. I heard you speak about service, she said, her voice growing stronger as she continued. I hope you know that there are many of us out here who are already serving, who have been serving for years, who just need to know that our leaders understand what we're trying to do." Charles listened intently, asking questions about her work, about the challenges she saw in her community, about what she thought could be done to address them. Their conversation lasted several minutes, with the entire congregation watching in fascination as their king engaged in the kind of detailed, personal discussion that was rarely seen in public settings. For Mrs. Hartwell, Charles moved to a group that included James Morrison, a young father of two who worked as a paramedic in East London. James had been hesitant to attend the ceremony, uncertain about the relevance of monarchy to his daily life dealing with medical emergencies in one of the city's most challenging areas. "I have to admit, Your Majesty, I wasn't sure what to expect today," James said honestly. "My world is pretty far removed from Westminster Abbey." "Tell me about your world," Charles replied, genuinely interested. James found himself describing the pressures facing emergency services, the way budget cuts had impacted their ability to serve the public, the frustration of dealing with problems that seemed to require solutions beyond what any individual could provide. As he spoke, he was surprised to find that the king not only listened but asked informed questions, demonstrating a knowledge of healthcare issues that James had not expected. "What you're doing is exactly the kind of service we all need to value more highly," Charles told him. "The people who keep society functioning, who respond when others are in crisis, who do the difficult work that often goes unrecognized. This is what I mean when I talk about service." The conversation with James led naturally to others in his section of the Abbey, including Susan Carter, a primary school teacher who had been struggling with the challenges of educating children in an increasingly complex world. She spoke about the way social problems manifested in the classroom, about children who came to school hungry or stressed, about the need for support systems that extended far beyond education alone. Charles listened to her with the attention of someone who genuinely wanted to understand. He asked about specific programs that might help, about resources that could make a difference, about the kinds of partnerships between institutions that might address these challenges more effectively. "Teachers like you are doing some of the most important work in our society," he told her, "helping to shape the next generation, often under very difficult circumstances. What support do you need? What would make the biggest difference?" Susan found herself outlining specific needs, from better mental health resources for children to more support for families facing economic hardship. The king took notes, something that surprised her. This was not just a polite conversation. He was actively gathering information that he clearly intended to act upon. As Charles continued moving through the congregation, patterns began to emerge in the conversations. People spoke about economic pressures, about social isolation, about the challenge of maintaining hope in difficult times. But they also spoke about their own efforts to make a difference, about community organizations they were part of, about the ways they were trying to serve others despite their own struggles. Dr. Amira Hassan, a young physician who had immigrated to Britain from Syria 5 years earlier, spoke about her work in a community clinic serving diverse populations. She described the way healthcare could be a bridge between different communities, helping people from various backgrounds find common ground in their shared need for care and healing. "Medicine is a form of service that crosses all boundaries," she told the king. "When someone is ill, their background doesn't matter. What matters is helping them get well." Charles was deeply moved by her perspective, by the way she had found purpose in serving others despite her own difficult journey to Britain. Her story reminded him of the complexity of modern British society, of the way people from many different backgrounds were contributing to the common good. "You represent the best of what Britain can be," he told her. "Someone who has found home here and has chosen to serve others. This is exactly the kind of story that gives me hope for our future." The conversation with Dr. Hassan drew in others nearby, including Robert Williams, a retired police officer who now volunteered with youth programs in Cardiff, and Marie Dubois, a French-born social worker who had spent her career helping refugees integrate into British society. Each person's story added another layer to the king's understanding of the challenges and opportunities facing the nation. What struck Charles most profoundly was the way these individual conversations revealed the interconnectedness of social problems and the need for solutions that brought different sectors together. The teachers' challenges were connected to the paramedics' workload, which was connected to the social workers' caseload, which was connected to the community health workers' patient needs. As he moved through the Abbey, Charles found himself having the kind of detailed conversations about social issues that he had longed for throughout his years as Prince of Wales. These were not the formal briefings or carefully managed visits that typically characterized royal engagements. These were real conversations with real people about real problems and real solutions. The Most Reverend Sarah Miller, Bishop of Birmingham, had watched these interactions with growing excitement. She had long advocated for the church to be more directly engaged with social issues, and she saw in the King's approach a model for how institutions could connect more meaningfully with the people they were meant to serve. When Charles reached her section of the Abbey, she spoke passionately about the role of faith communities in addressing social problems. The church has resources, buildings, networks of volunteers, she said. We have people who want to serve. What we sometimes lack is the coordination to make our efforts more effective. This sparked a broader conversation about the role of institutions in modern society, about how traditional organizations like the church and the monarchy could adapt their service to meet contemporary needs. Charles found himself energized by these discussions, seeing possibilities for partnerships and initiatives that could make a real difference. The conversations continued for over an hour, far longer than anyone had anticipated. But no one in the Abbey seemed impatient. Instead, there was a sense of witness to something historic, something that was redefining what royal engagement could look like. As the informal portion of the ceremony finally drew to a close, Charles made his way back toward the altar area. But instead of immediately beginning the formal recessional, he paused to address the congregation one more time. "I hope you will forgive me for keeping you longer than planned," Charles said, his voice carrying easily through the Abbey despite the informal nature of his remarks. "But what I have heard from you today has been more valuable than any briefing I could receive in a palace office. You have reminded me why this service exists, why we gather in places like this, why traditions matter only when they serve real purposes in real lives." The King's face showed the impact of the conversations he had just experienced. This was not the same man who had entered the Abbey earlier that morning. Something had shifted, something had deepened in his understanding of the role he was called to fill. "Each of you has shown me something different about what service means in practice," he continued. "Mrs. Hartwell, your 20 years at the food bank shows us what sustained commitment looks like. James, your work as a paramedic demonstrates how we serve others in their moments of greatest need. Susan, your dedication to educating children reveals how we invest in the future. Dr. Hassan, your journey and your work show us how newcomers can enrich our society through service." As Charles spoke, each person he mentioned felt seen and valued in a way that transcended the formal recognition they might have expected from a royal encounter. This was personal acknowledgement of their contributions, specific appreciation for their individual forms of service. What I have learned today is that the Advent message of preparation and hope is not just something we hear about in church, the King said. It is something that people like you are living every day. You are preparing better futures for your communities. You are maintaining hope in the face of significant challenges. You are the light that makes the darkness less dark. The Archbishop stepped forward, recognizing that this moment required some formal closure while honoring the extraordinary nature of what had just taken place. "Your Majesty, you have shown us today what it means to be a servant leader. You have demonstrated that true authority comes not from position, but from the willingness to listen and learn." Charles nodded gratefully to the Archbishop, then addressed the congregation one final time. "I want to make you a promise," he said, his voice carrying the weight of solemn commitment. "The conversations we have had today will not end here. The issues you have raised, the needs you have identified, the solutions you have suggested, these will become priorities for my work as king." He paused, looking around the Abbey at faces that had become individual rather than simply part of a crowd. "Within the next month, I will be convening a series of working groups focused on the challenges you have identified today. These will not be ceremonial committees, but working sessions designed to develop practical solutions. And I will be asking some of you to participate in these efforts. This announcement created a stir of excitement throughout the congregation. This was something unprecedented, a monarch committing to ongoing collaboration with ordinary citizens on matters of public policy and social concern. Mrs. Hartwell found herself wiping away tears, overwhelmed by the possibility that her decades of volunteer work might contribute to larger efforts to address poverty and hunger. James Morrison felt a surge of hope that the problems he dealt with daily as a paramedic might finally receive the attention they deserved at the highest levels of society. Susan Carter began thinking about the educational initiatives that might be possible with royal support and coordination. Dr. Hassan contemplated the healthcare programs that could be developed with proper resources and institutional backing. Throughout the Abbey, people were beginning to imagine possibilities they had not dared to hope for when they woke up that morning. The formal conclusion of the ceremony took on additional meaning in light of what had transpired. As the final candles were lit and the concluding prayers offered, there was a sense that something new was beginning, not just for the monarchy, but for the relationship between institutions and citizens in Britain. The recessional, when it finally began, was unlike any that had taken place in Westminster Abbey in living memory. Instead of the formal, distant procession typically associated with royal ceremonies, King Charles walked slowly through the congregation, continuing to engage with people as he made his way toward the exit. Children reached out to shake his hand. Elderly people offered blessings. Young adults asked quick questions about the initiatives he had promised. The king responded to each interaction with genuine attention, clearly reluctant to let this unique opportunity for connection come to an end. As the royal party finally exited the abbey, the congregation remained in their seats for several minutes, processing what they had experienced. Many would later describe it as one of the most significant religious services they had ever attended, not because of its formal elements, but because of the human connections that had been made within its sacred space. Outside the abbey, media representatives who had expected to cover a traditional royal ceremony found themselves scrambling to understand and report on something much more complex and significant. The conversations inside the abbey had been observed, but not heard by cameras, leaving journalists to piece together the significance of what had taken place through interviews with participants. Margaret Thompson, the retired teacher from Yorkshire, spoke to reporters about the way the king had listened to ordinary people. "He didn't just hear us," she said. "He understood us. He asked the right questions. He made us feel that our experiences mattered to him." David Chun, the young entrepreneur who had been skeptical about the monarchy, found himself reconsidering his views. "I came here today expecting pageantry," he told a television reporter. "Instead, I saw leadership, real leadership that connects with people and addresses their actual concerns." The impact of the ceremony extended far beyond those who had attended. Video excerpts of the king's address, along with accounts of his conversations with congregation members, spread rapidly through social media and news coverage. The image of a monarch walking among his people, listening to their concerns, and committing to action captured public imagination in ways that traditional royal events rarely achieved. In the days following the ceremony, Buckingham Palace received thousands of letters and emails from people across the country and around the world. Many shared their own stories of service, their own community needs, their own ideas for addressing social challenges. The king's commitment to listen and act had opened a channel of communication that had been closed for generations. The promised working groups began forming within weeks of the ceremony. Mrs. Hartwell found herself invited to participate in discussions about food security and community support systems. James Morrison joined conversations about healthcare delivery and emergency services coordination. Susan Carter became part of educational policy discussions that included teachers, parents, administrators, and policymakers. Dr. Hassan was asked to help develop programs for immigrant integration and community health initiatives. Bishop Miller found herself coordinating faith community responses to social challenges. Each person who had spoken with the king discovered that their individual concerns had become part of larger systematic efforts to address social problems. 6 months later, the first concrete results of these initiatives began to emerge. New funding for community food programs, expanded mental health services in schools, improved coordination between emergency services and social support systems, innovative healthcare delivery models for underserved communities. Each program bore the mark of the conversations that had taken place in Westminster Abbey that December morning. The Advent ceremony had achieved something unprecedented in modern British history. It had transformed a traditional royal observance into a catalyst for social action, had turned ceremonial monarchy into collaborative leadership, had made ancient traditions relevant to contemporary challenges. As Charles reflected on that transformative day, he understood that it had marked not just the beginning of his first advent as king, but the beginning of a new model for what monarchy could be in the 21st century. The ceremony had shown that leadership was not about standing above others, but about standing with them, not about having all the answers, but about asking the right questions, not about maintaining distance, but about building connections. The candles lit that morning in Westminster Abbey had indeed ushered in a season of hope, but not just for the Christmas season. They had illuminated a path forward for a monarchy that could serve as a bridge between tradition and innovation, between institutions and individuals, between the challenges of the present and the possibilities of the future. In the years that would follow, historians would mark that December morning as a turning point, the moment when the British monarchy redefined itself for a new era. But for those who were present in Westminster Abbey, it would always be remembered more simply as the day when their king chose to listen, to learn, and to lead through service rather than ceremony alone.